The termination happened 3 hours before I was scheduled to lock in a $3.1 billion acquisition. No warning, no discussion. Just a quiet HR notice delivered in front of executives who knew exactly what was at stake and chose to stay silent. Years of work ended because someone with the wrong last name decided I was expendable. The deal collapsed the same day. The company never saw it coming. Stay with me, because what followed wasn't outrage or begging. It was leverage, consequences, and a reversal nobody in that room believed was possible. If you've ever been sidelined unfairly, subscribe and tell me in the comments how it happened to you. The email arrived marked Urgent HR Required less than 3 hours before the final acquisition call, and the calendar invite already had my badge number attached to it, which told me everything before I even stepped into the glass conference room where HR was waiting with a printed notice and a neutral face. "This is effective immediately," the HR director said, sliding the document across the table, while two executives stared at the polished surface like it might crack. The reason line cited a process violation under revised executive protocol, a rule I had never seen and that had apparently been approved that morning. When I asked who authorized it, Lena Cole spoke from the doorway, arms crossed, voice steady, saying it was her call and that leadership required consistency. That was the first marker, the official betrayal, delivered quietly, formally, and in front of witnesses who understood exactly what they were allowing to happen. Security was already waiting to escort me back to my office. The badge deactivated with a soft click when I tried the reader, and someone I'd worked with for years avoided my eyes while collecting my laptop. In the hallway outside the executive floor, my phone rang. Marcus Hale from Orion Equity was calling to confirm the final numbers before the binding vote. "Where are you?" he asked. "We're queued up." The answer came out even and calm. "There's been a change. I'm no longer with the company." Silence followed, then a short laugh as he assumed it was negotiation theater. "Put whoever replaced you on," he said. "There is no replacement," I replied, and that was when Lena stepped closer, correcting me in front of him on speaker, saying the deal team was empowered to proceed without me. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He simply asked for the agreement appendix and read aloud the continuity clause that named me specifically as lead architect, the clause that allowed Orion to suspend the transaction if I was removed for any reason other than incapacity. The room went still. Phones started buzzing. Someone tried to interrupt, but Marcus kept reading, then ended the call with a single sentence. "We're pausing effective now." In the lobby, the visiting team watched as I was escorted past them with a small box of personal items, and I could see the moment they realized the acquisition they'd flown in to close was dead. Outside, the market reacted faster than anyone expected. The stock ticker dropped before I reached the parking structure. Calls stacked up. Messages came in from people who had sat silent minutes earlier. None were answered. That was the second marker, the beginning of the reversal. Not because of anything said in anger, but because the decision to humiliate me publicly triggered consequences nobody had bothered to calculate. By the end of the day, lenders requested clarification calls, clients postponed renewals, and the board scheduled an emergency session without me. The company issued a statement citing internal leadership adjustments, which satisfied no one. What mattered was already done. A rule invented to assert authority had invalidated a transaction holding the company together. Standing in my driveway that evening, the badge still in my pocket, the realization settled without drama or relief. The line had been crossed in full view, and the power they assumed they had just exercised had quietly moved elsewhere. By the next morning, the consequences were no longer theoretical. I woke to a single time-stamped alert confirming the suspension notice had been filed with the exchange, followed by a second indicating the credit committee had called an unscheduled review. I didn't need inside access to understand what that meant. Once the acquisition paused, the covenants tied to forward liquidity would trigger questions the company wasn't prepared to answer. Calls started before 8. First from analysts asking for confirmation, then from vendors requesting assurance, then from partners who wanted distance. I didn't return any of them. The board issued a short internal memo naming an interim lead and promising continuity, but the language was vague, and the market read it correctly as uncertainty. By mid-morning, the share price slid again. Not a cliff this time, but a steady bleed that signals doubt rather than panic, which is worse because it invites scrutiny. I watched a clip circulate from a financial channel where a commentator said the quiet part out loud. Removing the named architect before close didn't just pause a deal, it undermined credibility. Inside the building, I later learned, the executive floor had turned into a loop of emergency meetings, each ending with the same problem and a different excuse. Legal asked operations for a workaround. Operations asked finance for a timeline. Finance asked legal if the clause could be challenged. It couldn't. The clause was clean, negotiated in plain language, and approved line by line years earlier. Procurement froze discretionary spend. Sales leaders were told to reassure clients without offering specifics. Human Resources sent a follow-up confirming my termination and instructing managers to redirect inquiries. The attempt to control the narrative only amplified the signal. That control had been lost. What surprised me was how fast the external partners moved. A logistics provider paused integration planning. A regional bank delayed a renewal pending leadership clarity. A customer I had personally brought back into the fold asked for a call with someone who understood the architecture of the transaction. When they learned I was gone, they asked for time. The board convened an emergency session and requested a briefing deck that didn't exist because the assumptions behind it had evaporated. The interim lead tried to stand up a substitute model and ran into the same wall. The deal had been built around trust and continuity, not interchangeable roles. That afternoon, a reporter emailed a single question to the press inbox. Was it true the acquisition had stalled due to an internal termination over a protocol issue? And the silence that followed the send was the answer. I took a walk and left my phone in the car. When I returned, there were missed calls from people who hadn't defended the decision when it mattered, now asking if I'd consider helping clarify for the sake of stability. I didn't respond. The power shift wasn't loud or emotional, it was procedural. Every system designed to run smoothly assumed my presence without naming it, and removing me exposed the seams. By evening, the board scheduled another session, this time including outside counsel, and the company's largest lender requested written assurances by end of week. None of that required my participation to unfold. It required only the absence created the day before. The attempt to assert authority through a quiet dismissal had produced a public problem that couldn't be contained by memos or optimism. I understood then that the reversal had begun not because I acted, but because they had, and because the structures they relied on had been designed to recognize consequences, even when people refused to. The third day after the suspension was when the tone changed from urgency to damage control, and I could tell without being inside the building because the calls shifted from questions to requests. By then, the stock had settled into a pattern analysts recognize immediately. Sharp drops followed by shallow rebounds that fail to recover ground. That's not volatility, that's loss of confidence. Credit rating agencies place the company on watch, not a downgrade yet, but enough to force lenders to reprice risk. Procurement delays turned into freezes. Projects that had been greenlit quietly stalled because no one wanted to be accountable for spending while leadership was under scrutiny. I wasn't tracking this out of spite. People forwarded me screenshots, summaries, and internal messages without being asked. The silence from the executive team had become its own message. They issued another statement emphasizing continuity and teamwork, but continuity requires the same decision-makers, and teamwork requires trust, neither of, which existed anymore. Clients noticed. A regional partner postponed a joint announcement, citing timing considerations. Another requested an audit clause amendment before continuing work. These weren't dramatic exits, they were cautious steps back, the kind that compound over time. Inside the company, I later learned, managers were fielding questions they couldn't answer. Why had the acquisition stopped? Who approved the termination? Who was actually in charge? Each question bounced upward until it reached a layer where no one wanted to respond in writing. Legal counsel advised against reversing the decision publicly because it would expose governance weaknesses. Human Resources warned that reinstatement without process could trigger internal challenges. Finance needed clarity to finalize projections. The result was paralysis disguised as deliberation. Meanwhile, the people who had been present when the decision was made avoided being in the same room together. Responsibility became abstract, referred to as a process, a misunderstanding, a timing issue. It was none of those things. It was a choice, and it had been witnessed. By the end of the week, 2 senior directors resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. They weren't casualties, they were signals. They understood where the fault lines were and moved before they were blamed for standing on them. The board scheduled a town hall intended to reassure staff, but attendance was mandatory and questions were screened. That alone told employees everything they needed to know. I watched a clip afterward where someone asked about leadership stability and the answer drifted into values and resilience without naming anyone. That's when people stopped believing. On the outside, speculation hardened into narrative. Commentators stopped asking if the acquisition would resume and started asking what would replace it. Competitors circled, not to poach talent loudly, but to test contracts quietly. A supplier invoked a change of control clause to renegotiate terms. None of these moves were coordinated, which made them harder to stop. Each one was rational on its own. Together, they formed pressure. I received a call from a former colleague who had always been careful with words. "They're trying to rebuild a model without you," he said. "It doesn't close." I thanked him and ended the call. The board convened again, this time with advisors present, and discussed contingency plans that assumed reduced scale rather than recovery. The irony wasn't lost on me. The acquisition had been designed to stabilize the company and preserve jobs, and its failure was now forcing the opposite conversation. What struck me most was how little effort was made to address the original act. The termination was treated as a fixed point, something that had happened and couldn't be revisited, rather than a decision that could be acknowledged. That avoidance carried a cost. Without acknowledging the breach of trust, no corrective action sounded credible. I didn't feel anger watching this unfold. I felt distance. The systems were doing what they were built to do when inputs change. Remove a keystone and the arch adjusts, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. By the 7th day, the company's largest client requested a meeting with the person responsible for the original transaction design. When told I was no longer there, they asked to postpone their renewal. That was the moment the board stopped asking how to contain the situation and started asking who could fix it. The answer hadn't changed. What had changed was that they could now see the cost of pretending otherwise. The call came from a number I hadn't saved, which meant it had been approved by legal before it reached me. I let it ring once longer than necessary, then answered without greeting. The chairman spoke first, careful and formal, asking if I would be willing to meet with the board to discuss options. He didn't say return, he didn't say fix, he said options, which told me how far the situation had moved. I agreed to listen, not to help, and set the meeting for that afternoon at a neutral office rather than the headquarters where the decision had been made. When I arrived, everyone was already seated. No one stood. No one offered coffee. The tone was transactional, stripped of pretense. They began with acknowledgments rather than apologies, noting the market reaction, the lender pressure, the client delays. I let them finish. When they asked what it would take for me to re-engage, I slid a folder across the table and waited while it was opened. The document was short, direct, and written to remove ambiguity. Full reinstatement, not symbolic. Authority over strategy without second-guessing. A compensation structure aligned with outcome rather than tenure. Governance changes that required my approval on leadership decisions tied to the transaction, and a carve-out for any new initiative I developed while employed, with controlling interest retained by me. There were no raised voices. There were questions, but they were about mechanics, not principle. One director asked if the terms were flexible. I said no. Another suggested a phased approach. I said no. The chairman asked what assurance I could offer in return. I told him there were no assurances, only probabilities, and that the probability of recovery without structural change was low. That wasn't a threat. It was an assessment. They asked for time to confer. I stepped out and waited, not checking my phone. When I was called back in, the discussion shifted. They wanted to know if I would speak to the external partner again. I said I would after the agreement was executed, not before. They wanted to know how quickly I could stabilize operations. I said stabilization was already happening elsewhere, and that reversal would take discipline, not urgency. Someone mentioned optics, how it might look if I returned. After the termination, I reminded them that optics were the reason we were sitting there. The silence that followed wasn't resistance, it was calculation. They understood leverage when they saw it. The chairman signed first. The others followed, some with steady hands, some without. No one celebrated. When the last signature was added, the chairman asked when I would start. I said I already had, and stood. As I left, he asked about the person who had authorized the termination. I told him that was a governance issue for the board, not a condition of my return. Outside, I made one call, brief and direct, asking for a meeting to reopen a conversation that had been paused. The response wasn't warm, but it wasn't closed. That was enough. By evening, an internal notice went out announcing leadership realignment and expanded authority under my role. The language was careful, but the effect was immediate. Requests that had stalled resumed. Questions that had gone unanswered found a path. I didn't return to the executive floor that day. I worked from my office across town, reviewing reports and prioritizing actions that produced visible stability. The negotiation had not restored trust. It had restored structure. Trust would take longer, and I wasn't interested in performing it. What mattered was that the balance of power had been reset without theatrics, and that decisions would now move through a framework designed to prevent the kind of impulse that had triggered the collapse. The board had not regained control. They had conceded it quietly because the alternative was measurable decline. The first week back was defined by subtraction, not addition. I didn't announce a vision or hold a town hall. I removed obstacles. Approval chains that had multiplied during the crisis were collapsed into single decisions. Projects that existed to signal activity rather than produce results were paused. I asked for daily cash position reports, not forecasts, and required them by a fixed time with names attached. That alone changed behavior. People stop speculating when they know their numbers will be read. I met with lenders before they asked again, not to reassure them, but to outline what would and would not change over the next 90 days. Clarity buys time better than optimism. Inside the company, the reaction was cautious. Some expected theatrics, others expected retaliation. They got neither. Roles were reviewed against outcomes. A few executives were reassigned laterally, not as punishment, but to remove friction where trust had thinned. One senior leader resigned after realizing the new structure didn't leave room for informal vetoes. I accepted it without comment. Stability doesn't require unanimity. It requires alignment. I reopened the stalled transaction workstreams with smaller objectives that could be completed independently. No grand relaunch, just deliverables that could be checked off and verified. When external partners asked who had authority, the answer was clear and consistent. When internal teams asked whose approval mattered, the answer was the same. That consistency did more to calm the organization than any memo could. The person who had authorized my termination was no longer in strategy meetings. There was no announcement. Her access simply stopped appearing on invites that mattered. She was reassigned to a role with scope but no leverage, and the absence of spectacle made the shift unmistakable. People noticed who was missing long before they noticed who was present. By midweek, a revised operational plan circulated that reflected reality rather than aspiration. It reduced exposure, prioritized liquidity, and delayed expansion that had been planned to impress rather than endure. Some called it conservative. It was survivable. Client conversations changed tone. Instead of asking if the company was stable, they asked what had changed. I answered with specifics, fewer promises, more constraints. That earned more trust than broad assurances ever had. Toward the end of the week, I took the call I'd postponed, the one that would determine whether the suspended acquisition could be restructured. The conversation was controlled and narrow. Terms were worse. Timelines were longer. Oversight was heavier. I accepted that without argument. Survival had a price, and pretending otherwise would only delay it. Internally, there was resistance from those who had benefited from the previous ambiguity. They framed questions as concerns and delays as diligence. I addressed them directly, in meetings with decisions. Ambiguity loses its power when it's named. By Friday, the stock had stopped falling. It didn't rebound, it stabilized. That was enough for now. I sent one internal note thanking teams for execution, not resilience. Resilience implies enduring harm. Execution implies agency. The distinction mattered. I didn't visit the executive floor until the end of the week. When I did, conversation stopped briefly, then resumed. That told me the adjustment was underway. Authority had shifted from personality to process, and process favors those who show up prepared. I left early that evening with a list of actions for the following week that focused on continuity rather than recovery. Recovery invites nostalgia. Continuity builds forward. The organization was smaller in confidence than it had been a month earlier, but it was clearer. And clarity, once established, tends to compound. The idea didn't begin as a declaration or a breakaway plan. It began as a constraint written into a contract that most people skimmed past. The carve-out allowed me to develop new initiatives independently, as long as resources were accounted for and the company retained a minority stake. I treated it like any other operational problem. Identify a gap, test quietly, measure results. I asked a small group to meet after hours, not to brainstorm, but to map recurring failures we'd seen across industries when transactions stalled or collapsed. The patterns were familiar. Mid-sized companies facing complex deals without experienced guidance. Boards making timing decisions without understanding downstream exposure. Leaders confusing control with competence. We didn't give it a name at first. We gave it a checklist. The first engagement came through a personal referral, a regional firm considering an acquisition that was large relative to their balance sheet. I met them in a borrowed conference room, no slides, no pitch. I asked for their assumptions and listened for what wasn't being said. Within an hour, it was clear where the risk sat, and within a week, we'd helped them restructure the sequence to protect liquidity. The deal closed quietly. No press, just relief. Word traveled faster than any announcement could. Another call came in, then another. Each engagement was scoped tightly, priced transparently, and executed without ceremony. We documented outcomes, not intentions. I made sure every hour billed could be traced to a decision avoided or a cost reduced. Inside the company, no one objected because there was nothing to object to. The work was clean. The accounting was clean. The results were undeniable. I continued my primary role without reduction, which mattered. This wasn't an escape. It was an expansion. As the side work grew, I formalized it, named it, and set up its structure to scale without dependence on my presence in every meeting. That was the real test. If it couldn't operate without me, it wasn't worth building. We hired carefully, favoring people who had lived through failure rather than studied it. Each client received direct engagement, not junior substitution. That became the differentiator. The first quarter closed with revenue that exceeded conservative projections, and more importantly, with zero disputes. Clients paid because they understood what they were paying for. When we published a brief case summary, stripped of branding and attribution, it circulated internally and externally without promotion. People recognized themselves in it. That's when I knew it had legs. I scheduled a company-wide meeting not to announce a victory, but to explain alignment. I presented the new venture as an extension of the company's expertise, structured to operate independently with governance defined by the contract the board had approved. I showed numbers, not slogans. The room reacted the way professionals do when presented with facts. Questions sharpened. Interest replaced skepticism. I didn't mention the origin story. I didn't need to. The contrast spoke for itself. In the back of the room, I noticed the person who had once assumed authority could be exercised without consequence. She listened without expression. Her presence was no longer central. That was enough. Externally, the response was immediate. Industry publications picked up the model, focusing on its practicality rather than its backstory. A senior partner from the suspended acquisition mentioned us in an interview as an example of disciplined advisory work. Inquiries doubled. I put limits in place. Growth without control recreates the problem it claims to solve. Internally, some worried the venture would overshadow the core business. I addressed that directly. The core business was stabilized. The new venture was optionality. Optionality changes negotiating position. It changes how risk is priced. It changes who waits and who doesn't. By the end of the quarter, the numbers were clear. The minority stake held by the company had become its strongest performing asset. The board asked if I intended to separate it fully. I said not yet. Timing matters. Let systems reveal their value before you detach them. That patience unsettled some and reassured others. For me, it confirmed the long game was working. What had started as a defensive clause had become an engine, not because it was loud, but because it was built to function regardless of who was watching. The separation happened without drama, which felt appropriate given how everything else had unfolded. The board approved the structure in a closed session, and the announcement went out as a short filing that most people skimmed past. The company retained its stake, the venture became fully independent, and my role shifted from operator to governor, present where decisions mattered and absent where they didn't. That change altered the temperature immediately. Meetings shortened, requests became clearer. When authority is defined, people stop testing it. The suspended acquisition closed weeks later on revised terms that reflected reality rather than ambition. No one rang a bell. The stock moved modestly upward and held. Survival had been priced in. What followed surprised even those who thought they understood leverage. The venture's second quarter exceeded the first, not through expansion, but through focus, fewer clients, deeper engagements, repeat work. Companies came to us not for permission to proceed, but for permission to stop, to walk away from deals that looked impressive and felt wrong. That was the work I cared about. It required saying no more often than yes, and clients respected that. Inside the original company, leadership changed quietly. One resignation followed another, not in protest, but in recognition that the structure no longer rewarded informal influence. A new CEO was appointed with a mandate limited by design. I stayed on the board, long enough to ensure continuity, then stepped back further, attending only when votes required my presence. Distance clarified relationships. People spoke plainly when they knew performance, not proximity, would determine outcomes. I didn't mark the anniversary of the termination, but others did. A junior manager mentioned it in passing during a review, noting how different the environment felt now. I acknowledged the observation and moved on. Memory is useful, only if it informs behavior. The person who had initiated the termination applied for a role in the venture months later through the public process. I wasn't involved in the decision. The committee declined and offered feedback instead. The system worked as intended. That mattered more than any personal outcome. Public interest peaked and faded, as it always does. Headlines moved on. What remained were contracts, systems, and habits that no longer tolerated impulsive authority. The venture's reputation settled into something quieter than notoriety, reliability. That's what attracts the kind of clients who don't need convincing. I reduced my visibility further, delegating public-facing work and retaining veto rights I rarely used. Control is most effective when it doesn't announce itself. The company's minority stake became a dependable revenue line, smoothing quarters that would have once required aggressive forecasting. That was the final inversion. The entity that had dismissed me now depended structurally on what had been built in response. There was no satisfaction in that, just symmetry. Toward the end of the year, I addressed a room of professionals facing their own transitions. I didn't tell the story as a warning or a triumph. I described decisions, sequences, and consequences. I emphasized documentation, clarity, and restraint. Someone asked if it had been worth it. I answered that worth is a poor metric. Durability is better. The humiliation that began this chain had been public and final. The response had been procedural and cumulative. That contrast was the point. When authority is exercised without accountability, it creates exposure. When accountability is designed into systems, it redistributes power without confrontation. I left the event early and returned to work that no longer required my constant presence. The venture ran, the board functioned, the market adjusted. Nothing dramatic happened, which was the best possible outcome. The line that had been crossed that morning months earlier had not been uncrossed. It had been rendered irrelevant by a structure that no longer allowed such a line to exist. That was the ending I kept. Not revenge, not absolution, just a reordering that made repetition impossible. I didn't lose my job because of performance. I lost it because a system rewarded confidence without accountability. That's the part that stayed with me. The meeting room was quiet, the rule was new, and everyone who knew better chose not to speak, not out of cruelty, out of habit. Organizations like that don't collapse from one bad decision. They erode because arrogance gets normalized and silence becomes policy. What struck me afterward wasn't the speed of the fallout, but how predictable it was. When authority answers to last names instead of outcomes, risk multiplies quietly. People stop documenting. Decisions stop being challenged. Eventually, the system believes its own mythology. I've seen it. Before. This time, I was just standing at the center of it when it cracked. The lesson wasn't about revenge or even justice. It was about design. Cultures that punish competence to protect ego always create blind spots. They confuse compliance with loyalty and mistake calm for weakness. If I could distill what mattered, it would be this. Never confuse position with permission. If you're building or working inside a system, ask who can stop a bad call when it's inconvenient. If the answer is unclear, the cost will show up eventually, in money, in people, or in trust. I learned to watch how leaders respond when they're wrong. I learned to listen for what isn't written down. And I learned that the most dangerous phrase in any organization is, "We've already decided." How to get started today. Pay attention to who is allowed to question decisions publicly. Document agreements and changes, even when things feel stable. Notice whether rules apply equally at every level. Track outcomes, not just intent in your own work. Build leverage before you think you need it. If this sounds familiar, share how leadership culture shaped your career, good or bad, and pass this along to someone navigating it now.